Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mark Moss Show, where we talk about the decentralized revolution each and every week, talking about the way the world is changing. Of course, as we look at it through the lens of politics, finance, and technology, and of course that technology is Bitcoin, the decentralized technology that's changing the world. You know, I try to bring to you, some education, some late-breaking headlines, so you're always up to date on what's going on, and of course some interesting people, so you don't have to listen to me talk all the time, and that's what we have for you today. I'm happy to have Natalie Smolenski join me in the studio today. Natalie, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Yeah, man, so many good things to talk about with you. I'm excited to have you sitting down with me today. Trying to create content in this environment has been pretty easy because there's never ending amount of stuff to talk about. It's insane.
Right.
I know, I've read some of your stuff, and I love your take on just kind of the way that the world is changing, politics and things like that. I know you're involved in Bitcoin and mining and things like that. So let's kind of start with that.
Yeah.
I mean, it all wraps up together into one, right? It's like that's why I said I like to look at politics, finance, and technology together to get things in context. But we have like this time where we kind of have this aging empire that typically kind of goes in the same kind of course of action, where they're trying to grasp for control. We have the banking system collapsing. And then trying to grab any kind of control they can. It seems like they're kind of starting to seal off the exits, right? Trying to close down potentially exits into Bitcoin, things like that. And so we've seen attacks coming from every angle, including this week, even regarding probably what could control Bitcoin through both the Restrict Act. And then I know in Texas specifically, which has been very pro-Bitcoin mining, seems to even kind of be coming under attack. Maybe kind of frame up a couple of those attacks for us.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. We're definitely in the then they fight us stage regarding Bitcoin adoption. There's unmistakably a influential and growing phalanx of policymakers, including elected officials, who are openly hostile to Bitcoin and who are enemies to Bitcoin. I think a lot of people in the community have made good faith efforts to reach out to these folks and to educate them and to engage in good faith dialogue. But they're not interested in that. And so the thing about enemies is that, for the most part, the most effective way to deal with them is simply to keep building and ignore them, sort of create the alternatives that are inevitable to the point where they become irrelevant. But if they bring the fight to Bitcoiners, I think Bitcoiners are going to have to bring the fight back.
Yeah, I love that. Actually, I was in Jackson Hole recently for the Bitcoin Ski Week, and I came home and I kind of made a post where it's like, buying Bitcoin is a defensive move, right? I can go defend myself, defend my savings, my property, et cetera. But it's time to be offensive. We can't just be defensive. And I'm not talking about storming the Capitol, but building is exactly what I was talking about. Time for entrepreneurs to step up. So I love that. Love that. Do you think, are they hostile to Bitcoin? Are they hostile to cryptocurrencies? Or are they just hostile to technology and period?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap between those circles on the Venn diagram. And what's interesting is that the particularly the ESG kerfuffle over Bitcoin has raised the question of whether electricity usage itself will be politically restricted. The singling out of Bitcoin mining as an undesirable use of computational power is, it obviously politically ludicrous. But in an era where technology is accelerating exponentially, compute power is also accelerating. And so there is no future in which the world uses less compute. There's a world in which computational operations become more and more energy efficient, but the amount of those operations will continue to increase if civilization continues to advance. A world in which we use less computational power over time is a world in which human civilization is collapsing.
Yeah.
And that's not a happy or good world or a politically progressive world for anyone. And so I think there is a basic set of principles that policymakers and public intellectuals need to be educated in around technology having a material basis in energy and resources that is unallightable. You can't legislate that away.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. There's, I guess, kind of to the point that you're making. I mean, there's attacks coming from multiple different angles here, and so there's obviously the attack on energy, but that's not against technology. That's just against humanity, right? That's against human flourishing, as Alex Epstein would say. I mean, it's against energy use. Then they could claim that, well, Bitcoin is bad because it uses energy, but to the point you're making, all computing power uses energy.
Right.
Yeah, and then we have Elizabeth Warren going on this rampage today, trying to build a campaign basically against crypto specifically. Yeah, which is very rich for her. I saw Princey posted, her net worth is $67 million. She has $45 million in assets on a $280,000 salary. So she's enriched herself in this fiat system. I suppose that's one reason why you might be mad about another system. But the insanity. I think maybe it was Lynn Alden. She said, if you break down what is Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, it's like a decentralized ledger. It's databases achieving consensus. So we're gonna make a stance against databases that can achieve consensus.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
I feel like we're kind of getting to this point where technology. Well, I don't feel that. I believe strongly that we're getting to this point where technology is making governments obsolete and incompetent.
Yeah.
I just recently read this book called The Revolt of the Public. It was a really good book. I interviewed the author as well. And he basically makes the case that now, because we have access to information because of the smartphones, or not smartphones, but because of the internet. And really, just like in the Protestant Reformation, when the printing press released information, the governments, the church and state couldn't control that flow of information. And today, we have the same thing, same phenomenon, where the internet is the same thing, and they can't control that flow of information. And he talked about how in the industrial age, basically, Henry Ford kind of had the assembly line, and everybody moved, the masses moved into these factories, and they were able to create management techniques to manage the masses in this assembly line, and everybody was kind of the same. And how government basically took the same kind of formation, just like these mass factories could control the masses as digits, than government did. But we don't live in that anymore. Now we're in the information age. And he argues that the form of government that we have today is not compatible with the world that we live in, right? Because now we have this free flow of information. We don't have these central authorities anymore coming down and giving us this decree. And that's sort of kind of like what we have here. I want to get into that. I also, I like this. I was reading, I went back and read this article you talked about, the American Republic and Democratic Revolutions, which kind of seemed to fit into that a little bit. I want to dig into that a little bit. Is it Bitcoin that they're going against, like with this energy use thing? Is it crypto because of the sinking ship of the financial system, or is it technology overall? And I'm not sure what your answer was. Is it like all of that, and it's all a bunch of different factions?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are factions that focus on, more on each one of those categories, but there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of technophobia. There's a lot of, sort of phobia or hatred of corporations that are ostensibly, destroying the environment through all of this energy usage. And it's really remarkable for me to watch the cultural production that's happening around this. There's a new show, and I'm struggling to remember the title now that I watched. It's like starts with an E, but it deals with, it's sort of a near future sci-fi that deals with the effects of climate change in the imagining of the author. And it has a star-studded cast, including like Meryl Streep and Ed Norton and all these people. And watching it is like, it's like watching religious television. Like you immediately know who you're supposed to like, who you're supposed to hate, the good guys, the bad guys. There is a kind of apocalyptic worldview that's on display, a righteous minority that's fighting it. You know, it's very good versus evil. And you know, this kind of polarized view of the world has become more and more frequent, even among, you know, really thoughtful people, really well-educated people. I think in large part because the problems that we're facing as a species seem to be so intractable and complex that people don't know where to even begin in solving them. And so you have, you know, ludicrous suggestions like one of the ones that came out of one of the recent COP meetings, where Prince Charles suggested that, you know, we needed to spend 3 times the world's GDP to solve climate change. But okay, that presumes that we already know what the solution to this problem is. We just need money.
Yeah.
But that's truly not the case. Like money is not, a lack of money is not the problem here.
Yeah.
It's that we're dealing with something that is an emergent, complex, not just natural system, but social system, human economic system, and there are real effects to whatever policy direction we take. And you know, governments are proving that they are, in fact, not the venue that is capable of solving these problems. And so then the question becomes, what are the alternatives to action by the state? And we're seeing that in these orthogonal movements, of which Bitcoin is just one example.
Yeah, I love that. We have all these different complex systems that all interact with each other, which make it even a bigger complex system. And to think that you can fix something with one button push without affecting all these other things. I commented on Preston Pish put out a tweet earlier this morning, and he was talking about how with the banking collapse, a lot of these smaller banks going down is now affecting the LNG and the energy markets.
Yeah.
And so I commented, and I was like, so to fight inflation, we raise rates. To raise rates, we crush the banking sector. Then we have to bail them out. That's inflationary. Then we damage the energy industry, which is inflationary. So by thinking there's one single metric or one single trigger of interest rates, but then we cause all these other problems, and it's sort of like then thinking we can control the entire world that we don't even understand with a single metric like carbon or carbon emission.
Right.
So what do you think is the proper way to do it? And I would just say, for me, I think that complex systems have to be free and let them sort of figure it out. I think a lot of it comes from a worldview where these people have like a godlike complex. They think they're God and they have to go figure this out. It's up to them. I don't know. What's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So any bottom-up theory of change, you know, whether we're talking about Austrian economics or, you know, certain versions of socialism or, you know, anarcho-syndicalism or whatever, you know, is premised on the idea that human individual agents acting in their own interest will, over time, coalesce into social formations that give us more accurate information, for example, about price, better living conditions for everyone because we don't have these like over-leveraged social actors imposing their will on others, and create sort of de-risk change. So the system will include both the ability to exit and the ability to influence the system through voice, which are both necessary mechanisms of adaptation and reform. The problem with the way that governments are currently constellated is that they have a few tools in their toolkit. They like to cut off the exits. They like to cut off voice, so in effect render voice ineffective. And then they like to pick winners. And so
When you say they, in this instance, you're talking about like the powers that be, I guess, so to speak.
Right. So representatives of the state, government agencies, heads of those agencies, the executive branch, even in some cases, powerful legislators or judicial actors, they have a tendency to put their thumbs on the scale to such an extent that they render the system as a whole more fragile. And so what happens is that, social pressure for change builds up, it has nowhere to go, and it then gets released, either in like big acts of coordinated revolution, or in smaller acts of sort of stochastic violence, which like we've been seeing in the United States and like the mass shooting phenomenon. Like, why is that phenomenon accelerating? And it's not just people of one ideological orientation.
It's a good
people,
question that should be asked for sure. We should definitely stop. You were talking about sort of these systems. One of the things that you said a couple times was we have to have the ability to exit the system. Mm-hmm. So when I think about that, when I think about exiting the system, I think about much smaller systems. Sort of like the United States government was set up as a republic. Mm-hmm. And by being able to exit one system and enter another system, then it allows those systems to test different operating systems, if you will, as well as we get to see what competition can do to outcompete each other. Is that one of the things that you're kind of thinking about in the ability to exit the system?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the interesting things about the formation of the American Republic is, the earliest Americans didn't come to America to fight a revolution against the British Crown. That was not their goal.
Right.
They came for other reasons. They were exiting in order to trade more freely, worship more freely, escape the lifelong burden of debt that was just an ingrained practice in the old world, to live without the inherited burden of aristocratic power, which defined the horizon of class possibility in Europe. And so people exit in order to pursue specific goals, and then if the reasons for exit become unattainable, well, then the only other option is voice. And then if you can't use voice either to achieve your goals, well, at that point, you've sort of the social system is set up for violence to be really the only path forward. Yeah. And so the reason that democratic governments are so compelling politically is because they're ostensibly, in theory, structured to facilitate peaceful transitions of power. If you don't like one government, you can vote a different one in that you like better, and that makes your life better. And so you can use voice. And then if you still don't like that government, you're free to emigrate elsewhere. You're free to go elsewhere. What we've seen in the past few decades is a sort of capture of the democratic process by the political parties, who are themselves not democratic institutions and are very open about that.
But it's a threat to our democracy, we're being told.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in effect, like we can't exit as easily as we used to, and our voice is less impactful than ever before. And so then what is the remedy? Well, it's a little bleak.
Yeah, especially when the last option that you gave us, which there's other options we'll get to, but as you just laid that out, which is the democratic process, which
Yeah.
I view as the tyranny of the minority by the majority. So we could unpack that, especially if the democratic process doesn't work. But specifically, then if they limit your voice. And so, I've been kind of framing this up as kind of this war of information, really where we're going. I had a great conversation with Dr. Robert Malone, talking about what he framed up as the 5th generation of warfare, which is what he says that we're in, which is sort of this like psychological warfare, information warfare. And so the way that you win a war of information is by controlling the information. If I believe truth would win, but if they don't have truth on their side, then they have to censor that. And so I think that's sort of what we're seeing. So now they've captured the democratic process. Now they have to capture the ability to voice our opinions, and that's I've seen this coming. I'm sure you've seen it coming, and it really seems like it's coming to a head with this Restrict Act. I mean, this is potentially. I told my wife and my producer here. It might have been 6 months ago, a year ago, and I said, there's probably a good chance in the next 2 years I won't be able to do what I'm doing here in the United States, and meaning speaking out publicly, criticizing the government. And I said in the next 2 years. Here we are with this Restrict Act that potentially could like put that in check like right away. Would you say that's one big piece of them trying to kind of grasp on and control us from being able to speak out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Restrict Act is quite possibly the most totalitarian piece of legislation I've ever seen in the United States. And its adherents, or authors rather, have responded to me on Twitter and said, this is, you're spreading misinformation, you're misunderstanding the intent of the law. It's really nothing particularly new. Yeah. It's drawing on, this other, legislation on foreign investments and the Patriot Act and blah, blah. I would suggest, though, that the status quo already is quite draconian. And most people are just not aware of the extent to which the federal government has become capable of policing speech. And now the there's generally, by the time something is proposed as a bill for Congress, it's already been going on for a very long time. And the congressional authorization is sort of the fig leaf legitimizing practices that are already well underway. And so, for decades, the government of both parties, Democrat and Republican, has had the point of view that the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Defense should be able to regulate information technologies, including encryption technologies, including the internet, the broadest possible authority over telecommunications, because these things constitute potential national security threats.
It's always, for your security.
Yeah.
There's a couple pieces in there that were extremely troubling. I think one, first of all, to the point that you kind of said first, where some of them have kind of come out to, come on Twitter and said, hey, you're kind of misinterpreting this, or you're misconstruing this. A lot of this is intentionally broad and vague, so it can be interpreted any way they want. So that's a big problem. Couple of things that I saw, I mean, it seemed worse than what I might expect living in North Korea. I mean, if you violate this, you're subject to 20 years in prison, $1 million fine, and loss of all your property.
Right.
I mean, that's like Bolshevik Revolution stuff.
Yeah.
So I say something or do something they don't like, and I lose all my property, 20 years in prison, $1 million fine, and with no due process.
Yep.
Like, what?
Yep.
What? No due process. That's Bolshevik Revolution. That's Mao's Great Leap Forward. And then, even more troubling, well, I don't know about more, but equally as troubling, was the unlimited hiring power to positions of enforcement and unlimited funds with little or no review and immunity to FOIA requests. What? I mean, that's worse than. I mean, that's like trying to one up. I put a Twitter thread out and I said, if you can't beat China, join them, right? And it's like, I mean, we're trying to one up them. It seems like.
Oh my God. Yeah, 10x them. Like
10x them.
in China, if you access a banned app through a VPN, like the most likely thing that's going to happen is that your phone is going to stop functioning in certain ways until you delete the VPN, or until you delete the app. You may get fined, like less than $100. In extreme cases, if they choose to come after you, they could put you in prison for a few months or a few years. But it's nothing like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. Nothing like this. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just insane. And again, it's equally broad and vague so that it can be applied. And it also allows them some deflection, like, oh, that's not really what it says, which means it's open to interpretation, which means
Yep.
that they could interpret however they want. We were talking about the Restrict Act, which is potentially the most restrictive act we've ever seen come forward. Natalie, this is really scary. The one thing that scares me about this is there's a lot of big name representatives signed on to this bill. This isn't like some little obscure freshman put this bill forward. Like we see that happen all the time, and they don't stand a chance. This has a lot of very prominent people on this bill. I can't imagine it would go through like this, but because of all the big names that are on there, it makes me think maybe it could. What's your take on that? You think this gets trashed and then probably comes back a little bit lighter, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think it's evidence of the accelerating consolidation of power in the imperial presidency that has been underway for decades now. So every presidential administration pushes that trend further and further. And then often, the next administration gets elected on a platform of rolling back some of that consolidation of executive power, but they end up just doing it more.
Yeah.
So in the case of the Biden administration, the Restrict Act was actually born out of the Democratic Party's opposition to President Trump's executive order to ban TikTok, which was challenged in the courts and never implemented. Biden ran in part on, not taking these kind of unilateral executive actions. But instead, he issued an executive order to research the problem of TikTok and apps. And so now it's been researched, and this bill is a product of that research. And lo and behold, it's even worse than President Trump's executive order. And so what happens is the new normal just becomes worse and worse and worse with every administration until the point where we no longer have a republic.
Right. Yeah. That I try to always remind people to keep that in mind. Laws, whether you like them or not. When I turned 18, my dad told me, remember, Mark, when you go to vote, every law, whether you like it or not, is less freedom. That was the one thing he kind of instilled in me. And I think I look at like Ron DeSantis, what he's doing in Florida. And while I generally like what he's doing and I would almost want to move to Florida to go support him, a lot of times I actually look at it from both sides and I'm like, wait a minute, though, that's an authoritarian move. And that could easily be, just because I agree with it doesn't make it right, because that could easily be used against me. And so he's also doing very authoritarian moves. I just happen to agree with him, so it doesn't offend me as much. But you have to be able to look at it from both sides. Now, the way this is going, and to your point, it's an escalation. It just continues to build on top of its next. Although this, I call it the Obama-Biden administration, has taken things to a whole nother level. Now I saw John Kerry's talking about how Biden's now going to release a bunch of executive orders for climate change now, including regulating cars and trucks and all these things. Now, it looks sort of bleak. To your point, you've said, they've kind of co-opted the democratic process. Our vote doesn't matter so much anymore. Now they're doing lots of things to try to restrict our voice. That's pretty scary. I'm very bullish on these decentralized tools. Obviously, Bitcoin, the decentralized monetary network, and then like Nostr, like a decentralized communication network. Super bullish on that. And so I know the state can't shut those down, but they could threaten to kill you. Right. Which is sort of almost what this is. This is like almost death. Right. And so like they know they can't shut the Joe Rogans down or a million little me's. But if they could just say, hey, we'll put you in prison forever, then they sort of do. So you had said earlier, talking about kind of exiting the system, and we kind of started about, I said, it's time to go on the offensive. What do you think of, like, what's our best course of action if we can't, we can't vote. Our vote doesn't count as much. Our voice can't really be heard. I mean, do we try to change things through the economic means?
Yeah. So, Bitcoin is a fantastic example of not using the political process at all. A bottom-up theory of change through user adoption of a superior money. And so it's just, superior technology. Once it's out of the bag, doesn't matter if you like it or hate it, it's going to win.
Right.
And so I actually am very optimistic and very bullish on the Bitcoin front. But a world in which Bitcoin wins isn't necessarily a good world. Like when we're talking about the demise of confidence in the American empire, de-dollarization. I mean, that's a world in which billions of people suffer,
Yeah.
like really, really suffer.
In the
And a lot
transitional
of,
period, most likely.
right. And this is why, interestingly, a lot of people refuse to entertain the Bitcoin thesis and are just like viscerally, emotionally opposed to it because they're like, well, Bitcoin only wins if everything falls apart, and you people are psychopaths to want that. Well, it's not that we want it, it's that you cannot trust structures of authority over the long term. Any authority, even the ones that start out nice and good and that you like, because power corrupts always, no exception. If it can do something over a long enough period of time, it will. That's the whole premise of the Enlightenment theory of governance.
I
And
would,
so,
I would want
yeah,
to just maybe see if I could push back on that for a second. To your
yeah,
point, a transition is going to be very difficult, and to the point, I would also agree. If the dollar system comes crashing down anytime soon, it's going to be a world of hurt for a lot of people.
yeah.
However, I saw Lynn Alden posted this earlier today on Twitter, and she said, as shown in the charts below, dollar homogeny in its current form is synonymous with anti-Mercantilist policy, meaning that it hollows out domestic industrial capacity in exchange for widening the external reach of political military influence of the country. So basically, you've seen all the charts on like WTF happened in 1971. Since we've gone into this system, this dollar homogeny, this fiat money system, inflation has ravaged everybody in the U.S. It's hollowed out the middle class. It's driven all types of societal conflicts. It's, as charts show on the website, led to, incarceration rate going up, divorce rates going up, health, obesity rates going up, and what we've done to the rest of the world. I mean, we live with this inflation, and some of us get by okay. A lot of people are not doing okay, but the rest of the world has been completely ravaged, and we're causing one revolution after another, because they can't afford to eat what we've seen in Lebanon and Turkey and Argentina and Venezuela, and a lot of that's because of the dollar. So it's sort of like these anti-energy people saying, "Hey, this apocalyptic future," and Alex Epstein's like, "It's apocalyptic today." For a lot of
Yeah.
people. And so when we think about this dollar demise, what is it really doing? It allows us to sanction anyone, allows us to keep military bases all over the world. But what is it doing to increase the quality of life of anybody in the United States and even more specifically the world?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It was very, very much like Lynn said earlier today. What's good for America, the empire, isn't necessarily good for America, the country.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah, and so I'm in full agreement. I mean, we need to reshore our manufacturing capabilities. We need to invest in domestic talent, in our education sector. Like these are things that we've just increasingly outsourced at all levels of the socioeconomic ladder to foreign talent outside of the United States. Well, we should be incentivizing people to come here and build in America, literally, making America great again,
Yeah.
by becoming the world's talent capital.
Are you one of those
We're very,
MAGAs? You want to make America great? I'm kidding.
yeah, yeah. But no, you're absolutely right. And this is the thing about structural transitions. They may be necessary. They may absolutely be the healthier thing over the long run. But the longer a problem has sort of festered, and the more bags people are holding, in the old system, the more painful that transition is going to be.
Yeah, good point. Man, that's so much good information, so much food for thought. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to the Mark Moss Show, sitting down with Natalie Smolenski. You can find her on Twitter at @nsmolenski. We'll leave it in the show notes down below. Man, we covered a lot of ground. Natalie, thanks so much for taking the time. And with that, we got to go. Thanks so much for listening.
My pleasure.